Aloha, everybody! It is your boy, Manga Man Drew, and I'm here to do something new. I am going to be doing in this video a review of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, the first chapter of Part 9 titled The JoJoLands. Yes, I am a big fan of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and I really am such a big fan that I decided that I want to review, at the very least, the first chapter that has come out for Part 9 of JoJo's. And as a little refresher or introduction on my JoJo experience, I have been reading JoJo's at least Part 8 for almost the entirety of the run. I started to jump in more or less halfway through during the urban gorilla fight, and I have been reading JoJo's ever since then. I've always been fond and interested in JoJo's. I've seen parts 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the anime, started reading at part 6, read through part 7, and read through the entirety of part 8, and now I'm here to start doing my reviews for part 9. And this is going to be a very interesting journey that we're going to be going on. Not only is there a lot of firsts going on in just this first chapter alone, but there are some interesting things that are going to be going on most likely in this part with what we're going to be getting in this chapter. So let's dive in and talk about what is going on with the beginning of JoJo's Part 9 and why this may be, and I apologize for what just came out of my mouth, the best part that may ever come out of JoJo's, and you're about to see why. For starters, let's talk about some of the firsts that we've gotten in this chapter. And the first thing that I really want to bring up is the fact that we are just jumping into the idea that stands exist in the world of JoJo's. Because at the very least, for Part 7 and Part 8, we knew for a fact that stands existed in the world because of the previous 6 parts, but we've never really just dived right into it and have Araki himself tell us that yes, stands exist in this world. Yes, people have stands, and we just dive right into it. Now, we have had parts where we've gotten to see the users of the stands of the Joestar bloodline use their stands, relatively speaking, within the first chapter, but this is on a whole nother level, to the point of it being like the first time where we really are introduced fully to the stand before we even reach the second chapter. So that's something interesting about this chapter, as well as this is the first part that actually stars 2 JOSTARS. Now, we know for a fact that they are JOSTARS by name, but what is a true indication, more or less, of a JOSTAR is the star birthmark. And we do see that one of these characters is confirmed to have the birthmark, but we do not know the other one. And another thing that I want to bring up is that this part is stationed in Hawaii. That's why I'm wearing this getup. And this is very interesting because this is probably going to be a mixture of what we've gotten throughout the entirety of JoJo's, having it being set on an island in the case of Japan. When you really think about it, is not that much of a surprise because this would be technically the third part in JoJo's where you have a character that is just American and the story is just set in America. Now, we do have part 2 that is not technically stationed in America, but we are first introduced to the Joestar of that part in America, as well as that being introduced once again in part 6, and then once again this being introduced in part 9. So that's just some preamble that I really want to get into, as well as just getting to see the aesthetic coloring of this new Joestar in full color and its beauty. We're going to be diving more into the actual chapter proper and talk about some stuff that is very important for us to know about what's going to be going on in the story moving forward. And I would like to break this part into chapters when it comes to the first part of this chapter and the second part of this chapter. I know that I flipped them, but I think you get the gist. And the first part of this chapter is just really just getting to begin to know who these characters are through just the situation that they are placed in, because we do get to see most likely the 2 main protagonists of this story, but one of these characters is more of a main protagonist than the other, and these characters are in a very precarious situation. And what is very interesting about this chapter, and what's going to be very interesting about this story when it involves these characters, is that we already have a main goal when it comes to just literally the first page or the first few pages of this chapter, which is the reveal that JoDio, who is going to be most likely the main Joestar, is being revealed that he gains wealth within the subtropic island. And this is very interesting because this is probably the first time in a JoJo's part where we are introduced to a JoJo via narration, and they're the ones narrating it, but they're also giving sort of a roadmap for where the story is going, and that JoDio Joestar, which is most likely going to be the main Joestar that we're going to be following, is saying that this is the story of him becoming extremely wealthy in the subtropics. This is great because we rarely ever get like a streamlined plan through the parts that is very continuous. And that is something that is explicitly stated within the first chapter. We rarely, if ever, just have the main Joestar being more or less an active user or an active pursuer in the role at the start of the story. There's usually a secondary or tertiary character that actually forces them down this road, but we see that that is sort of the case, but also this Joestar is being a little bit more active in achieving this goal, as we will see later on. And we see that this chapter starts off with confirmation that the story is being set in Hawaii, near Pearl Harbor at Honolulu City, where we're introduced to some very, how should I say, American cops and the situation that these Joestars are being put in, where they're being harassed by the cops are abusing their power, and this is more or less just social commentary by Araki when it comes to the American system and the political abuse that comes from the police themselves. And it gets really serious when we see that one of the cops actually assaults one of the Joestars that is female appearing. And that phrasing of words that I am using is very pertinent for the character as we dive a little bit more into these two different Joestars. And what this entire situation is due is really showing the characterization of these two characters, which we later learn are the characters of JoDio as well as Dragona. And you can probably already tell the references that are going on in this chapter when it comes to the names alone. JoDio, and very much like the entirety of this part most likely, is going to be taking inspirations from part 5, especially with the name of JoDio containing both titles of Jo and Dio in it, in reference to Jotaro, to the JoJo bloodline, as well as the Dio Brando bloodline, combined together in this character, very much like how it's combined into the character of Giorno Giovanna in part 5. And when it comes to JoDio, he really has the essence of what and who Giorno is, but also a little bit more of, in my opinion, a bit of JoLand, where we see that how he reacts to the police, how he reacts to the cops, what they do to his quote-unquote brother. And we learn a lot about JoDio's character in this interaction with the cops. We see that he is very much violent and quick to anger and has a short temper. We also see that he has a sense of intelligence when it comes to what he does to the cops afterwards to hide the evidence of his wrongdoings. But we also see that he does have a genuine care for the people in his life and the people that he considers family. A lot of these tropes and these characteristics are shared by both the character of Giorno as well as the character of JoLand. And we see that the person that he is trying to protect is his quote-unquote brother via Dragona. And we see that when it comes to how they are portrayed in this chapter, and most likely throughout the entire series, they are being portrayed to be, for the most part, very caring and protective of their younger sibling, as well as being able to show that they can be calm and collected even in stressful situations, such as being assaulted by a cop in a very unprecedented and very unprofessional manner. And I would say many of the characteristics that they share within this character is very similar to that of Hermes from part 6. Not only based off their personality, but also based off their aesthetic. And we will talk about the aesthetics a little bit more later on when it comes to this character and when it comes to what they represent as a first in the world of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. But pretty much we get to see how these characters react in a situation where we are actually introduced properly to their stands later on in this chapter, but we actually get to see glimpses of their stands in this confrontation, but more explicitly, we get to see JoDio's stand just straight up front. which is something that is not actually common if you go back and look at the other Joestar introductions, where we rarely, if ever, get the immediate showing of their stand within the first chapter in a very prominent way. And I'll talk a little bit more about what their stands actually do towards the end of this review, because that is where they are properly introduced when it comes to their stand names. But when it comes to the stand of Jodio, all we really know is that most likely than not, it pertains to water, while with Dragona, it has more to do and involves with more of a colony-like stand. But continuing with more of their characterization and ties to the themes and sort of the aesthetic of part 5, it is confirmed that these two individuals, these two Joestars, are just straight up criminals. And I don't mean just like petty criminals like Jolene, which also ties into the fact that Jolene was technically also a criminal, but like they are like real deal criminals. Like they're dealing in drugs, which is actually hilarious when you think about the fact that if Jodio is inspired in a reference to Giorno, Jodio is okay with selling drugs to kids, while Giorno was strictly against it. And the parallels between Giorno and Jodio don't even stop there, especially when you realize that they are both 18 within their respective parts, which once again confirms that they are more analogs to one another and how Jodio is the analog for Giorno in part 9. And yeah, that's pretty much what the first part of this chapter is about, while the second part of this chapter is more getting more into the backstories and the background of certain characters outside of the main Joestar bloodline. And getting into the second part of this chapter, we are confirmed that both Jodio and Dragona are related to one another, and they are related to other Joestars in this universe, and how we are introduced a little bit more to who their mother is and how she is the sister of Holly Kira. And from here, we do learn a little bit more about her. We learn that their mom's name is Barbara Ann, and that they are actually from the mainland, specifically from Atlantic City. And in this chapter, we also learn more about their mom's daily life and how the reasoning why she can live this life so easily is because they are working behind the scenes to make sure she is safe. And we also get a little bit more about who Dragona Joestar is, where we learn a little bit more about them, how they like to take walks or jogs on the beach, how they like to eat watermelon, how they like females' fashion, as well as potentially this being the first Joestar to be more of a trans character. Because throughout this chapter, Dragona is being referred to as an older brother, and how apparently within the Japanese, they do not give them any form of pronouns. However, the implications in this chapter, as well as the relationships that they have with Jodio, it would not be far-fetched to say that they are most likely than not trans, especially with the line that they have cosmetic injections injected into their chest. So if this is to be the case, that this is more of the first proper trans character in JoJo's that is a main cast member and a main Joestar bloodline member, this will be a very interesting topic for Araki to tackle in this series. And speaking of Jodio, we actually learn a little bit more about his character in this and in this initial chapter, we also learn a little bit more about Jodio and his character and what he's doing in his life right now. We know that he's a student, and we also know that he's liked by many people at his school. But the two more important things that we learn about Jodio in this chapter, and what will most likely then not really confirm what type of character he is moving forward, is that he has always been someone that is trustworthy to the point of being a gopher for drugs ever since that he is a child, and even doing it now as he is a teenager. And second is how he has this idea or this mindset about how the world works via the idea of mechanisms. And how the best way that I can really conclude what this is how it's very similar to what we got in part 7 when it comes to the flow of calamity, where he compares himself to a nerdy student and how they are not that different between each other, but yet the nerdy student has a worse off life while he has a better life. which is very similar to the ideas of the flow of calamity, the flow of negativity when it comes to what is going on in the world, and really more or less tied to a major idea and theme of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which is fate and destiny. So it's something that we have tackled in previous parts, especially within this new universe, but most likely it is something that we know or that we've known, and we have it being gone by a different name. And how this mechanism that JoDio is talking about is actually what is going to be influencing him to actually be the individual that becomes wealthy within these islands. So there's a lot that we can really talk about, but a lot of this is more of information that we've known throughout the entirety of these first initial parts of this new universe, just being expanded upon in different ways by how different individuals view it. And from here, we're approaching the end of the chapter where we're introduced to a few more new characters. 2 of them are introduced more properly in this chapter, and a third is most likely going to be introduced later on in the next chapter. Because we're introduced to another character named Paco Lovelantis, where we get a little bit more information about him. We learn that he's 19, but he is still in high school. He and JoDio know each other, but they're not really friends. He was chubby at one point. He has a specific marker that identifies him by a damaged ear on his left side. And most likely than not, the thing that defines him the most is that he is nothing but a pure kleptomaniac. Basically, he just likes to steal stuff, and it is very important because it actually ties to his stand ability, which we see in this chapter, which for the most part, it's explained that he's able to have full control of his muscles to the point where he can steal someone's wallet without actually physically stealing it with his finger, and keep it in place in other parts of his body, such as keeping a mosquito in place when you flex your muscles. So with that, we've seen 3 stand abilities in this chapter, and not all of them are technically combat based when it comes to melee fist-to-fist conflict. Which makes sense because this has been a running motif within this part of JoJo's, where those who have stands are not necessarily stands that are punch-fighty ghosts, but more of unique abilities that are being used in very unique ways by the individuals. And this is very much seen by the idea that none of the stands that we've seen in this chapter have a very prominent humanoid ability or humanoid figure. And finally, we are being introduced to the final character of this chapter by the name of Meryl May Q. And there's a lot of information that we have on Meryl in this chapter alone. For instance, she's actually the principal that we saw earlier in this chapter that was interacting with JoDio in the hallway. She is also the owner of the boutique that JoDio and the rest of the gang are currently in, and some of them are working in as well. She's also a wife with a apparently handsome husband. She's a fashion designer, also the leader of their gang. So with that, we can imply a lot about her character, especially for how JoDio talks about her and how she is a very capable person. And how she is actually the individual that is going to most likely allow for JoDio and the gang to achieve the goal stated at the beginning of this chapter of JoDio becoming the wealthiest individual in the islands. Because she pretty much introduces them to a job where they're going to have to need to steal a diamond worth $6 million from a Japanese man visiting the island for just 12 days. And we see that both Paco and Dragona are involved and ready to participate in the heist, as well as JoDio going along for the ride as we get the end of the chapter where we are introduced, or should I say confirmed, that another individual coming into the fray that we saw early in this chapter having a conflict with JoDio on the bus and actually accepted drugs that he bought from JoDio earlier on when they were in front of the school, is also going to be participating in this heist, where it's confirmed that this heist is something that may actually be above all of their heads, as the final page of this chapter confirms the 3 stands of 3 of the users in this chapter, with JoDio having the stand of November Wayne, of JoDio having the stand of November Rain, Dragona having the stand name of Smooth Operators, and Paco having the stand name of The Hustle. And as we could have predicted, the names of these stands are all musical references and references to Guns N' Roses, Michael Jackson, and Van McCoy in that order. So yeah, I can say with certainty that this is going to be an amazing start to a chapter, and that this is most likely going to be an amazing series of JoJo's. for the main reason that the main plot of this story is going to be a heist. Something that we've never seen in the story before, so I can't wait to see what Araki will do with the story moving forward, and what more we're going to learn about these characters in the future. And I think that in the next chapter, we're going to be introduced properly to the fourth person in their gang, and from my opinion, is very reminiscent of both Mista as well as Food Fighters from parts 5 and 6. But we won't know until most likely next chapter, but all I can say once again is that this was an amazing chapter. I really loved everything in this chapter, and I can't wait to see where this chapter goes in the future, and I want to see who the person is that has this diamond. They say that they are Japanese, so it's probably going to be a character that we've seen prior. Maybe it's Yasuho. Maybe it's Jobin's children. Maybe it is Josuke himself. We just don't know, and we probably won't. We just don't know, and we probably won't know for a while, but let me just tell you that I'm very excited. But yeah, that's all I really have to say about this chapter. Hopefully you enjoyed this chapter. Hopefully you enjoyed this review. And if you want to see more of me tackling JoJo's in a more traditional fashion to my other reviews. So yeah, if you liked the video and you want to see more JoJo's content like this, leave a like down below, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell to be notified for whenever I upload more content like this. Do all that cool jazz, and hopefully I'll be able to catch you in my next video. Goodbye!